This is Theology on the Go, a brief interview about an eternal truth.
It's like the New Testament talks about. It's our lives are like grass, here today and gone tomorrow. And if we don't look at all of life like that, even our own lives, if we don't look at our wives and our children and the things that make up our life, like our jobs, our calling, even the things that we would put most value in, that would define us, give us identity. If we don't hold all of those things with an empty hand and see them as things that are here today and gone tomorrow, like the flowers of the field, then we have all of a sudden allowed something to creep into our thinking that has an opportunity to contest God's authority in our lives.
Hello and welcome to Theology on the Go. I'm Jonathan Master, joined as always by my friend and co-host James Dolezal. James, how are you today?
Jonathan, I'm doing well.
Well, I am also doing well because we have our good friend Jeff Stivason with us in our ongoing series on Pilgrim's Progress. We're slowly walking through this very important classic Christian book. And Jeff, as our listeners will know, is a professor at Reformed Presbyterian Theological Seminary and also is a pastor at Grace Presbyterian Church in Gibsonia, Pennsylvania. So, Jeff, thank you for coming. Thank you for giving us some more of your time and expertise. Today, we're going to discuss Vanity Fair.
Yeah, thanks. I appreciate being here. It's always good to be with you guys.
So I want to start. This is probably one of the best known sections of the book, partly because that title, the title of the name, the city, Vanity Fair, is used in so many other kinds of things today. And so let's start with that. Let's start with the name that everyone's familiar with, Vanity Fair. What's the significance of that name in the context of Pilgrim's Progress?
Yeah, that's a really, I think that's a question worth thinking about, because when you look at the text itself, he defines it. He says that Vanity Fair is where everything is light. It's almost as if it were immaterial. But then you look at what Vanity Fair is made of, and it's made of weighty stuff. It's made of substantive stuff. It's made of houses and it's made of families. It's made of countries. It's made of buildings. It's made of, right? And it's all of this stuff that's of substance, and yet he says about Vanity Fair that it's lighter than vanity itself. It's lighter than emptiness, if you will. And yet, like he says right after he defines it, he lists all the things that it's made up of, and those things are all substantive, which produces the question, are all of the things that make up Vanity Fair bad, or are they all immaterial? And I think that the answer to that is no, they're not all bad, right? When you look at the list, it's made up of some bad things, but it does talk about houses and trades and places, and it talks about countries, and it talks about servants, and it talks about, and this is the interesting thing, it says lives, like our lives make up Vanity Fair. And so not everything in Vanity Fair is bad per se, but anything in Vanity Fair could be bad.
So it's not necessarily all bad. Some of it is, and certainly all of it could be. But would you say it's ephemeral? It's a vapor. It's something that doesn't in and of itself really last. Is that what he's driving at?
Yeah, I think that's what he's driving at. I think that it's like the New Testament talks about. It's our lives are like grass, here today and gone tomorrow. And if we don't look at all of life like that, even our own lives, if we don't look at our wives and our children and the things that make up our life, like our jobs, our calling, even the things that we would put most value in, that would define us, give us identity, if we don't hold all of those things with an empty hand and see them as things that are here today and gone tomorrow, like the flowers of the field, then we have all of a sudden allowed something to creep into our thinking that has an opportunity to contest God's authority in our lives, contest God himself in our lives.
Think of this even with regard to 1 Corinthians 7. Let him who has a wife be as though he had none. It's obviously not neglect of spouse, but just simply not to treat marriage as a forever thing. I think we do that with marriage and other good relationships. We treat them as if these are the kingdom and the eternal promise, and they're temporary goods meant to be enjoyed as we're traveling. There is a difference. Do you think this is important, Jeff? As I'm reading through this, that faithful and Christian are actually travelers passing through Vanity Fair, but the others, that's home. That's it. They're not going anywhere. And maybe that's part of the contrast as well. That they're all in Vanity Fair. And in fact, the whole thing about Vanity Fair is we all live in it through the whole duration of our lives this side of heaven. But do we live in it as travelers, pilgrims, or do we live in it as those who are really trying to find our summum bonum in it?
Yeah, I think that's a really good insight, and it goes along with what he actually says. He says, Bunyan says, look, if you want to avoid Vanity Fair, you've got to go out of the world to do it. So he's talking about everybody sort of having to live in some way Vanity Fair, and yet the question is, in what way are you living in it? Are you a pilgrim, a sojourner, passing through it, or are you someone who's making it your home, your kingdom, your heaven on earth, like you said, your summum bonum?
Then if we're passing through, we can do what Paul says: use the world as though not using it.
Yeah,
Uh, I remember Sinclair Ferguson in a class once when I was in seminary saying that that's actually one of the keys of Christian liberty, is having your heart free about the thing, so that take it or leave it, you're not going to lose a step.
yeah.
Um,
I think the one of the things that I think is helpful about the way Bunyan frames it, and it's just quick, and I think I mentioned it the last time, but he reiterates it here over and over again. But he talks about evangelist's face being an ancient countenance, and then he refers to Vanity Fair as an ancient city, as an ancient place, and he does that over and over. And the thing I think that he's trying to communicate is that the gospel, and the one who speaks the gospel, right, is really speaking an ancient word, a word that a word that really goes back to because he talks about the origin of Vanity Fair. And really, Vanity Fair comes about when the gospel is initiated back for him 5,000 years ago, right? And so there's this idea that this is the way you live in this ancient Vanity Fair. You live in it by remembering that there's something um, there's something ancient in the message that gives you vitality, that gives you a direction, that gives you hope as you work your way through this world.
So Jeff, as the pilgrims enter Vanity Fair, there's kind of a great deal of commotion around that. Eventually they're put in a cage, but what are the reasons for that commotion? From the standpoint of Vanity Fair, it's an important thing or a significant thing that these pilgrims are coming through. So talk a little bit about that. Why there's the commotion, and then we can even get into why Christian and faithful are put in a cage.
Yeah, it's interesting. I thought to myself when I was reading this past week, I thought, the interesting thing is that he talks about hubbub, and I thought, I wonder if that's a play on barbarian, bar, like foreigner, we don't understand the tongue. And it struck me that, like, he does say that in his second reason. He said they seemed barbarians, each to the other. This is in the second reason he gives. But yeah, I mean, the reasons are they don't talk like the people of Vanity Fair. They use the language of Canaan. They don't look like them. As he says, their raiment was different than that of those of Vanity Fair. And he also talks about how they just didn't have a care for the things of Vanity Fair. The merchandise was something they just passed by, and they cared. He says they cared not so much to look at it. So it's interesting. All of a sudden, you realize that the commotion, the hubbub, occurs because these people look very much like foreigners living in the world, which when you think about it, this is really good. This is really good stuff for us today when we think about living in the world. I think so much of the church longs to look like the world so that it doesn't look different, so that it doesn't find itself ridiculed or even persecuted or sort of on the outs. And so it does its best to try and look like the very thing that it ought to oppose.
That's a good observation. I think there's some will want to say, well, we need to have a good reputation with those that are outside, but our Lord said that if they hated me, they'll hate you. And there is something about cross bearing that is going to result in a kind of social ostracization, and even hostility. Also, if you don't run with them, I think Peter speaks this way. If you don't run with them in the same excess, they're not. This is the thing in Vanity Fair. They're not content to leave well enough alone. If you don't buy, if you're not there engaged in the trade, if you don't value what they value, or the way they value it, then they resent the very presence of the pilgrims in their city
Yeah.
as a result, and it raises their ire, the way that they dress, the way that they sound. I think that's a challenge to me. Is our conversation as Christians, is it not that it has to be a phony piety about it? I think that's easily seen through, but a real heavenly mindedness, a real awareness of sin and of grace, and that these things so saturate and fill our conversations and just come up and out of us very naturally that makes us sound strange to those that are not partakers of grace. It's a
Yeah.
challenge. It's a challenge to me. Or do we kind of dial down our language again so that we don't sound like barbarians?
Yeah,
To
I was thinking about what you were just saying that about Hebrews, where he challenges the Hebrews because they're dull, they're sluggish in their faith, and I think it's 5:11. He talks about that, and then he circles back in 6:12, and he talks about that, and right in the middle of those two uses of the idea of sluggish spiritually is that classic apostasy passage. But the thing that I think really is something about that passage. There are many things, I guess, that are really interesting about that passage. But the one thing is that he tells them, not only do I think better things concerning you, but he actually says to them, you guys ought to be seeking to emulate those who are faithful, those whose lives are worthy of emulation. In other words, the church has a place in in the in the person's life who is struggling to desert the faith, who is struggling with flirtations with the world, leaving the faith for the things of the world. And I think Bunyan is really, I've been struck by how much he sees the pastor as the gospel influence in somebody's life, so much so that it's almost embodied, like I mentioned, the ancient countenance. But when you look at just after those three things that make them different, it says they were looking gravely um, upon him. The guy that asks them, "What will you buy?" and Christian and faithful look gravely upon him and say, "We buy the truth." And there's that word gravely again. It's the word that was used to describe the portrait of the pastor in the House of Interpreter. It was It was the word that was used to describe other pastor figures that we've encountered in the Pilgrim's Progress. And here, they are like the pastor. They are beginning to embody him, and and I think in some ways, I think you know that means that they're beginning to take serious the things that are serious, and they're beginning to see as immaterial the things that are immaterial. I think that's the whole idea of um, the world is at the pastor's back, even as he has his eyes cast to heaven. They are becoming like him. And, I don't know, we talk about sometimes the church even, um, not 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 wanting to be challenged or to be found in that spot where they're different. But this is just as much of a challenge for a pastor. If Bunyan's right, then every pastor reading this book ought to be saying to himself, am I the embodiment of gospel principles that's worth the people of God following and emulating? And boy, is that a challenge, isn't it?
It is a challenge. There's a real juxtaposition here too, just in the word that he chooses when he says gravely, because this is like the city whose name is exactly the opposite of that.
Mhm.
Their city's name is vanity, and then gravity, light, weightlessness, unseriousness. And so when they look on him gravely, I mean, nothing more like distinguishes them from the world than
Yeah,
that they're actually serious about serious things.
yeah,
I just wanted to ask about the real conflict that ensues because of these differences that we've been drawing out. There's a significant conflict that ensues with Christian and faith, not between Christian and faithful, but with Christian and faithful and the residents of Vanity Fair. And then there are accusations brought against faithful by three witnesses. And so, talk a little bit about that moment of opposition and then the accusations that faithful has brought against him by envy, superstition, and pickthank.
yeah. I think it is when you really get down to that opposition. It's an opposition that comes from the fact that these men don't want to put weight where weight isn't due. They see these things as their pastor saw them in their rightful place. That is at their back, and the people living, in Vanity Fair just can't tolerate that. It's sort of like Romans 1. Not only do people who sin want to sin, but they need people to affirm them in their sin, and we see that very thing going on today, and it's right here in Vanity Fair. And so they put them in a cage, and what's really interesting is they put them in a cage so as to be a spectacle. Um, they right they want to look at them, mock them, and treat them as if these people you know are different, and they are different. And and what's interesting along the way is that you see Bunyan drop in um, little hints that people are believing, and so obviously that's that's true because somebody emerges from Vanity Fair to follow in Faithful's footsteps, and obviously that's hopeful. And so, um,
It's
but
like Paul in the Roman prison, and then those are the household of Caesar who are actually coming to faith. But there he is, like a cage spectacle,
yeah,
and then it's a savor of life to those being saved.
yeah. Yeah, the thing that struck me is, we saw the man in the cage in the House of Interpreter. So they're a spectacle. And we're gonna see them in a cage again in the castle. And the question that you have to ask if you've read ahead is why the difference? I mean, here it's almost as if being in the cage actually inflames zeal. And they actually want they want the preferment. You know, each of them are hoping to die, you know, and fulfill evangelist's words. And you just sort of wonder, is it because they just came out of the wilderness and they're in the town and they're sharp now. They're sharpened because they've come out of the wilderness. Whereas, when they go into the castle, they're just having a hard time alone, isolated. And the path has gotten a little bit difficult. But it's not like the wilderness. Um, there's just a number of things that just and when we get there, maybe we can talk more about it, having read that portion and compare back. But I think it's worth comparing because why is it that you can be put in a cage at one point and it really stir you up and be put in a cage at another point and actually think about taking your own life?
I think you're right in terms of the path that got them to the cage. The path that got them to the cage later on was a path it was a waywardness. They'd gone off it through Bypass Meadow. So I do wonder if like the lead up to it really sets you up for success or for real difficulty. But we will visit that.
Yeah.
Uh, let's talk about the accusers because they each make a slightly different, varied accusation against Faithful and Christian. So, what are we to make of those three sort of types of accusation?
Yeah, I was looking forward to talking to you guys about this because, when you think about envy and superstition and pick thank, and the way that Faithful answers each of them. There's with envy, there's sort of envy is jealousy and kind of hateful because you have and I don't, and there is a sort of a spitefulness to envy's accusations. He's even saying, I don't know this man, but and I'm going to give you this a little bit of information, but if you need more to condemn him, just circle back to me, and I'm sure I can find something in the files to bring up. And so there's that, and it's funny because when Faithful answers him, uh, there's something to the whole idea of, I never said what you said I said. What I said is consistent with the word of God, but there's just a flat out denial. And the superstition, um, one, you can't, you know, you wonder if superstition is taking you back to sort of a Rome or a Church of England kind of investment in, the superstition of uh, whatever the sacraments or whatever other things that would trump or stand over the Word of God. And that's almost consistent with, I think, the way that Faithful answers him. He says, look, the question is, he even says that in the worship of God, there is required a divine faith, but there can be no divine faith without divine revelation of the will of God. In other words, the will of God stands over our practices. And um, you know, I realize that you're saying that my actions and my conversation seem to be saying to you that you stand outside of the faith because of the way you observe and practice, but I'm only doing that because I'm standing under the revelation of God, where you're standing over it through your superstitious practices. And then pick thank, he's just picking, right? He's just picking where he might find um, sympathies and benefits. And I think it's funny the way Faithful answers him. He's just like, and you're fit for hell. Okay. Yeah, there's not even an argument there. There's just you and all the attendants like you are just, yeah, not fit for anything else. So, it's striking when you see those kinds of accusations coming out of Vanity Fair. They're not quite what you expect, are they? Just kind of maliciousness, accusations of something he didn't do, condemning our faith, our religion, our religious practices, and then just kind of pick thanks kind of nastiness. You just it's you expect something a little more, but it's like the lead up to something. It's sort of like it's sort of like watching a TV show about a famous crime, and you go into it expecting something really, well thought out and kind of elaborate and genius. And then in the end, it's very disappointing because you realize it's just sinfulness. It's just, maybe even like blunders and happenstances, and it never has that fantastic aspect that kind of you're expected to sort of come away with. And I don't know if that makes sense or not, but I felt like that with Vanity Fair. It just didn't you didn't come away thinking that was spectacular. You came away thinking those were run-of-the-mill kind of accusations that caused this man to lose his life.
Well, yeah, they're mundane accusations. Obviously, the jury is stacked against him, and they're going to be hostile towards Faithful. And as you mentioned, this leads to Faithful's death, but it does end on something of a positive note. As you said earlier, Faithful and Christian are ready to die if that's what it takes when they're put in the cage. But then also there's this consolation at the end because Faithful dies, but Hopeful emerges, and it's a hopeful note to end on in a sense, coming out of Vanity Fair.
Yeah, yeah, it really is. And you know, um, you know, it's a brutal death that he dies. He experiences faithful. He experiences all kinds of nasty things. But it is true, right? It's the blood of the martyrs is the seed of the church, and so hopeful grows up out of the ashes of faithful's death. And it's it's consistent with what you read in the scriptures themselves. You find Saul standing in approval over the murderers of Stephen. You find him watching their coats, and it's just a beautiful thing, not the death itself, but the fact that, someone is plucked from the fire like Paul or like Hopeful or somebody like that.
I love the song that Christian sings right after his friend departs and goes to his reward. And while certainly he hates death, he mourns, but not as one without hope. Interestingly, that kind of cues the entrance of a new character.
Mhm.
Uh, and I thought I would just read his song because it's really very beautiful. After his friend departs, well, faithful, thou hast faithfully professed unto the Lord; with him thou shalt be blessed. When faithless ones with all their vain delights are crying out under their hellish plights, sing, faithful, sing, and let thy name survive. For though they killed thee, thou art yet alive. It's really that's a Christian song at a funeral for a
Yeah,
Christian.
yeah, yeah, yeah. It's beautiful.
Well, Jeff, as always, thank you for coming on and lending your insight and expertise to us as we march through Pilgrim's Progress. And we are grateful as always for your time.
Oh, it's always fun to be with you guys. Thanks for having me on.
Good. Well, until next time, thanks.
Thank you.
James, it's always a joy to talk with Jeff, and he's thought deeply about Pilgrim's Progress, and especially in this particular episode of Vanity Fair. It's a reminder that Pilgrim's Progress is episodic. It's not a kind of consecutive picture of the Christian life, but these are realities. This reality of Vanity Fair is a reality that we all live in and have to deal with as Christians.
I think it's an important thing to remember in reading the book, right? That it is episodic and it's not necessarily it's told linearly, but you're in Vanity Fair until the day you enter the celestial city, so that it's not just a couple of weeks of your life or years that you pass through it, but really we're all passing through it because it is the world. But good reminders in it too, that even while we're in the world, we are lights in the darkness, and that God has his people. When Christ says that he has sheep not yet of this fold, they are certainly living in Vanity Fair, and it's our faithful witness as we traverse through this world that calls sinners to light and to life. And certainly faithful bore the testimony to the end, and Christian alongside him bore a faithful testimony. It's a challenging section, because we are so easily caught up in the innocent or good things of this world, and the temptation to become obsessed with them the way that the world is, I think, is ever present for the Christian. So a good caution.
Yeah, challenging and sobering. If you know anyone who might be helped by this episode or other episodes of Theology on the Go, please pass it along to them. We want to reach as many people as we can. And if you are able to rate and review the podcast, that helps us do that. So please take a minute and rate and review wherever it is that you download this. If you're able to donate to the Alliance of Confessing Evangelicals, you can do that at alliancenet.org or placefortruth.org. There's a donate button there. And as always, thank you for listening to Theology on the Go, a brief interview about an eternal truth.